Greetings. Welcome to the Dragon Con Urban Fantasy Track author interview series. I am here today with longtime supporter and friend of the track, R.R. Virdi. And we are going to have a bunch of questions about his work, his large variety of work, I might say. So, Ronnie, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And I know all of our viewers will as well.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, this is wonderful. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, great. Thank you. Now, the first question I always ask everyone in one of these interviews, mostly because I just think it's interesting, is did you read fantasy or sci-fi or, as a child or young adult?
Yeah, so my love for SFF actually comes from my mother because she's from India, but one of the popular shows that still got broadcast over there when she was growing up was Star Trek. So she grew into sci-fi, especially very early on. And then when she immigrated here and I was born and raised here, she had a collection of old books. And she was at that time more into horror and traditional mainstream like thrillers and stuff. But that old sci-fi bug of her still existed. So she would take us to libraries when we were really young. And one of the first things that I got hooked onto, interestingly enough, was Star Wars, is specifically the boom of the 90s Star Wars books that were coming out, written by authors like Kevin J. Anderson, Timothy Zahn, David Farland. And I particularly gravitated, I remember, to what was it? The Han Solo trilogy. There was a trilogy of books that follow his life as a prequel before the original movies take place. And I fell in love with them. I was checking them out. Oh, God. Every time they were due back at the library, I just renewed them over and over, probably becoming a menace to anyone else who wanted them. I fell in love with the character and that background. And then eventually my best friend and an employee at Borders bookstores got me into my love of urban fantasy with the Dresden Files, because it came out while I was just finishing up elementary school. So I think like sixth grade, like I was last year, Dresden Files had just come out and it had started being pitched to me. And that definitely swept me away.
Yeah, that's a good starting point. And speaking of urban fantasy, that was where your writing career more or less began, at least in terms of published material. And then, with the Grave Report, and my copy of the first book is a digital copy, so I'm holding up here the second one. And anyway, so yeah, with the very cool covers, which I'm sure when people see those, they're probably thinking, oh, "What happened to this guy?" But anyway,
Right.
yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you kind of moved into urban fantasy as a first for
Oh,
getting going?
oh, absolutely. So I recently talked about this on another podcast, and hopefully I'm in a better place to talk about it and not lose my composure. But uh, I had been querying and writing for some time, just basic fiction that I wanted to. And I actually started with epic fantasy at 18. The summer before college, I tried to take my life. I've struggled with depression for a very long time, and I'm in a better place now. But when I started writing, it instantly clicked. I figured out what I wanted to do with my life, to the point where I never finished college, because I just knew there's nothing I can do in college that will guarantee me a writing career. So I might as well use the time to keep practicing my skills and figuring stuff out. And years went by, and nothing had clicked. And Ghost Story, I believe, which, yeah, after changes, Ghost Story had just come out by Jim Butcher. I had gotten a copy from Borders, and I was just reading it and loved it. And then within that week or two of the launch, he was on the tour, and he was actually visiting a local Barnes and Noble of mine, which is still there. And I do patronize. And I went there for a signing, trying to sneak my Borders copy through Barnes and Noble, because I think they had a policy where you had to get your book there, and it had to have the sticker. And somebody covered for me in line saying like, "Oh yeah, I bought him that copy, and here's my receipt." And got to go in there, and Jim was talking about the book. And then through the signing, um, he asked me like how I'm doing, and I kind of broke down, because I had originally planned to take my life that night, and I was thinking that the one good thing I would have happen would be to meet Jim and get my book signed, and it's a good note, because my depression was in a very bad place and unrelated to writing. That just exacerbated it. And I told him this, and he stopped. He paused, and he actually told me that nobody can write my story except me. Nobody could decide what happens to me but me, and that if I kept going, one day I could be like him, where I could be signing books. I could be maybe up for an award with him. Maybe I could be on a bestseller list with him. Maybe I could be in an anthology with him. And that completely changed my life because I took that to heart. Um, and I was like, well, I've always loved urban fantasy. I like the biggest guy who writes it. Why don't I write one of my own? Because I do genuinely love the genre. Um, and that led to the Grave Report, which has been compared as Quantum Leap meets the Dresden Files or the TV show Supernatural, because it's a monster of the week.
Mm.
The protagonist is a soul who every book starts off in the body of someone who was killed by the paranormal, which is where the Quantum Leap aspect comes in. And then he has to use their minds, bodies, memories, and skills to solve their murders. And I guess there was always that just subconscious connection to the genre because of what it meant to me. I first came in with Jim's work, introduced to urban fantasy as a very young child, and then full circle, he had such a formative impact on my life at around 2021. So it just makes sense that I would gravitate towards that genre for my initial debut. And I've always loved the genre for what it can do, because it allows you to tackle stuff that fantasy as well as more mainstream contemporary novels do, but you can do it in a fantastic setting, but it's set today. So it's familiar. People of all kinds can exist in an urban fantasy. It's not, relegated to what you think someone might have to look like or act like a couple thousand years ago because you're trying to compare it to a normal fantasy. There's a lot more fluidity, diversity, and openness of what the genre can be. And I kind of looked at it like this open box of there's so much more to explore in urban fantasy.
Right. And I think that's one of the appeals of it. And I don't know that if that's true for you as a writer of it, but one of the things that appeals to me as a reader, and I guess the reason I run this track is that, it's a real world setting, but you're placing all of these other elements in there, and you're saying, what if? And I think that the combining of those two things is what has always intrigued me. And I never get tired of seeing the different ways that people do it. And your series, your Grave Report, is an example of that. I'll show the cover again, just in case anyone watching this is not familiar with this particular series. But can you give us? And you did already explain a little bit about what the series itself is about. But can you give us just a little bit of a brief elevator pitch description of how would you describe that series if you had to tell somebody in a brief elevator pitch?
Oh, absolutely. I'll just go by the number of reviews, and then it really is being compared to Quantum Leap meets Dresden Files or Supernatural. There's a monster of the week. It's very focused on the mystery angle of both the monster mythology and a whodunit. So it's serialized the way Dresden is. Every book can be read alone, almost as a standalone, and then there's a larger meta plot. So for fans of either of those IPs, it works really well. And then some of the humor gets comped very much to Deadpool.
Oh yeah, I can see that. Yeah, Vincent does have a bit of a deadpan approach, but given his, maybe that was the wrong term to choose,
or the right term,
or the right, depending upon how you look at it. But that does kind of fit his situation. Now, during the time that you were writing the Grave Report, about halfway through, you also with Dangerous Ways,
right,
which is kind of a blend of urban fantasy and regular traditional or epic fantasy. And what's your elevator pitch for this one?
Oh,
so
that was kind of a love letter to both of those genres, and that I wanted to see if I could take far more fantastical elements than I had seen and try to incorporate that into like an epic urban fantasy. And I still haven't figured out what the elevator pitch for that is, because it felt very much like an anime to me, which I'm also a fan of. And there are some that go a lot harder with the traditional epic fantasy elements in a modern contemporary setting. There's a lot more numinous, ethereal magic that happens. I suppose American Gods is one of the most popular versions of that. And I kind of wanted to thread that, that eye of the needle, if I could, that way, with Dresden Files fans will appreciate this, or Patricia Briggs fans would appreciate it, and so do people who would read more like a Neil Gaiman-esque contemporary fantasy, and then have it somewhere be between the lines.
Right. Yeah. No, I get that, and I know I had read something that you had. It was a question someone had posed to you, and you had said that that's what you were looking for, was a way to merge those two things,
Right,
because they were loves of yours, and it's like, well, how can I make them come together? And
right, right.
I think you do a good job of it
Oh,
in
thank
that
you.
book, and maybe someday we might get more of them.
Yes,
Is it
yes.
possible?
I actually had the series planned, but I intentionally wrote them the way I had seen a lot of mainstream contemporary fantasy novels written, where each one can be read as a complete standalone, so that
Right.
if there are more, you're not like, I need to go back and reread book one. There's enough of a recap in the second, but book one doesn't leave anything dangling. It leaves possibilities, but it for that moment, that story is still complete enough. I would like to. Unfortunately, just life and everything going on with the current new series with Tor and Golanx has been very time consuming.
Oh yeah, yeah. I understand. It's not as though it's not as though you can always do exactly what you want either at the time that you want, right?
Right.
Uh, but I feel good to know, to have it confirmed yet again, that it's not forgotten, uh, or that it's still on the table
Oh,
somewhere.
right. Absolutely.
On your mind table. Now, you also did take kind of a brief foray into what is more commonly known as lit RPG,
Mm.
um, after or around this same time.
Hmm.
Uh, I think it was 2018, 2019 that the two parts
Yeah.
of the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Monster Slayer online came out. Can you tell us a little bit about that series, or it's a duology, I guess, and how you got involved in that? What kind of led to that for you?
Okay, so the genre was just starting to pop up, and at this time, I was also streaming just for fun because I've been a lifelong gamer. I used to compete when I was very, very young, particularly with the Halo franchise,
Hmm.
because that came out right when I was becoming preteen, middle school to high school, and Xbox was what I had. And a teenager with free time, I poured all my energy into that. And when this came around, I was really fascinated by the blending of the video game culture with fantasy. And an author friend of mine began writing it, and he was making a lot of money, and he was telling me to write it for that reason. And I wasn't sure because the money seemed nice, but I had never read lit RPG at the time. They were compartmentalized loves of mine. Video gaming were separate, and then writing was separate.
Hmm.
Um, so I read a few, and I was like, "Oh, this is really fun." And then I still had obligations with other books, though, and he kind of dared me. He's like, "Well, I dare you to write it. Can you?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I can." What do you mean, like, can I? I've played more games than you. I've competed in games. Like, I could do this in my sleep. And he's like, "All right, well, do it." And then I took him up on the offer, and I did. And the first book especially launched extremely well. Um, I was actually flabbergasted by how much it made in such a short time. But it was one of those things where once I had done it, I had so many other projects that I had to keep going with, and obligations. I felt really wrong to if I tried to make this something to really milk out over a long time. So I kind of pared it down to where the two books could at least hold the series in place, similarly to what I'm doing with Dangerous Ways, where I can return and do more, and they can kind of rest where they're at, and I can honor other commitments I've had to fans before that.
Sure.
And it
Yes, and
was
those.
this. Oh, please
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh no, I said those two were Goblin King and Beast Queen. Is that correct?
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. But anyway, I'm sorry. We were
Oh
both
no.
talking at the same time.
Oh,
What were you going to say?
oh, I didn't know if you wanted me to explain like the background of what like inspirations and
Yeah,
any of
yeah.
that.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
So
Because I know that there are some people who really enjoy that genre, and
right,
invite to
right.
hear about this.
So particularly, I've always been a fan of a series of games by From Software called Dark Souls. They recently had one of the largest titles called Elden Ring, and those are inspired by a very dark Japanese fantasy manga and anime called Berserk, which was one of the inspirations. So my take is a lot on the darker edge of I guess the psychological side of what you'd encounter in lit RPG. And then the other inspiration is a very famous Japanese RPG series called Monster Hunter, which is kind of what the name suggests, where you live in a fantasy world and you hunt monsters. And it gets kind of macabre in that you once you kill them, you use their body parts to make body armor and weapons and gears, and but it's done in a very bright Pokemon looking way. Like the art style, it doesn't look gruesome. It's not a very
Right.
bloody franchise. It's more just weirdly horribly cutesy in that you kill a monster and then you make a sword out of a dragon spine and you wear like dragon scale armor. And I thought the symbiosis of those could be really cool, where I could tackle some really dark philosophical and psychological concepts that Berserk and Dark Souls bring up, as well as the fun and the very cool video game action stuff that I love of, particularly the Monster Hunter franchise. That lets me also talk about monster mythology, because the series does go heavy into that as well. Because I'm a mythology nerd.
Well, I'm sure that that's probably fairly evident, but I'm sure a lot of your readers are as well. So,
right.
oh. Now, in 2019, you also took a kind of did a little sidestep into something that was very blatantly sci-fi with Star Shepherd.
Oh yeah,
and what can you tell us about that one?
So that was a favor as well as a love letter involving a friend of mine. So my indie editor at the time, for side projects I would do, started her own publishing company, and she wanted a sci-fi because she particularly loves that genre. And she had been so sweet and kind to me. I was like, I'll write a book for you, even if it doesn't sell. I don't care. Whatever you want, just to have a title for your independent press, because she'd always been there for me and just been a great person. Mm. And I wrote a love letter in terms of language to space westerns, because I've loved everything from Cowboy Bebop. I love westerns themselves. I loved obviously Firefly, and I wanted to write something more on the pulpy side that allowed that love to just come through and do a very fun action story about a space captain on the run, with a really prototype government project that could change the fate of the universe. But the entire language and the culture and the way the combat went was derived clearly from westerns. And I was really, really happy with it. It came out, I gave it to her. I have no clue how it's kind of done, and I'm actually really happy that way, because I was genuinely happy to write the project for her and just get it out.
Right. Well, that's very cool. I'd never heard the story behind that, so that's very interesting. And I had almost forgotten about it myself, to be honest with you, just because it doesn't typically come up when discussing your other works. And so when I saw that, I was like, I mean, I know that once I saw it, I said, oh yeah, I forgot about this. I'll have to make sure and ask him.
Right.
So now what's consuming your life the most with writing, and this is the paperback copy,
right?
The cover is the first binding, and that was that book has, or that series, not just, but I suppose this book in and of itself has been pretty life-changing for you. So I mean, it really has. And so tell us a little bit about what's your elevator pitch for this series, and just talk about your some of your experience getting involved with how that got published and everything.
Oh yeah. So this was a love letter to mythology, comparative mythology specifically, in storytelling, as well as the stories I've loved throughout my life. Because as a mythology nerd, which you've seen, like my entire Grave Report story, everything I've done before is all about monsters of the week, gods, lores, like the Supernatural show would do serialized. The older I got with more time, I started realizing, the more I read, how many shared beats and archetypes and tropes that we only associate with the West actually exist everywhere in the world. And some of their origins are in places like Asia, modern, what is now modern day Iran, Persia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and these cradle of life civilizations, because they were some of the first ones to create the original epics. And their mythology spread out of what's now known as the Proto-Indo-European culture, which influenced South Asia, the Norse, the Greek, the Levant, and then parts of the Baltic and Eastern Europe. And as a lot of their mythology as well. And then the storytelling would keep building on these certain tropes. And the more I studied and started seeing them, the analogies between similar storm gods, dragon slaying, and what people eventually codify and reduce into the hero's journey, I was like, oh, this is really cool. I want to write the story storytelling, essentially, in a way, through the eyes of a heroic character who sort of follows both story beats and progressions from stories in our world that are fiction, as well as stories from our world and mythology, and sort of create this fun comparative mythology love letter to all of storytelling. Um, and then the process of that was really painstaking because I actually had to work with a voice coach overseas through something like this. Like I think we were using Zoom instead of StreamYard, but to get a certain lyricism because there were so many different languages I wanted to draw inspiration from and epic poetry. So, for example, the oldest epic poem, an epic that we have in the world, is actually a South Asian one called Mahabharata, and it's written in couplet format. It's an epic story. It's 3 million words, I believe, long. So it's the world's largest epic poem, and learning to write certain things that would emulate that, but in English, was very difficult because my writing style up until that point had been very clipped and noir, which you'd expect in urban fantasy, more direct prose. And I had to start learning that, as well as how to incorporate nesting stories better, because a lot of epic poems have stories within stories, and how to also still make them relevant to the story themselves. So this is kind of a love letter to all of fiction and mythology, but also a love letter to us as people, because the way all those stories spread and those repetitive beats and tropes throughout history up to today has been because people have just loved those stories when they would hear them along the Silk Road and other places, and they wanted to co-opt them into their religion or culture, or because they were inspired by something. If people research, there's actually a lot of analogous beats between the Iliad and Odyssey and Mahabharata and Ramayana, which are the two South Asian epics, which makes sense because there's actually a history of Indo-Greek kingdoms. There was trade through the Indus Valley with Greek civilizations. We found records of like an Indian Greek coin. So, and we also know that philosophers traveled and traded with South Asia because of the spread of Buddhism, particularly, and the philosophy that spread. The world's oldest and first residential university where people could go stay and live was called Nalanda, and it was in South Asia. And there were people as far as Japan who would come and study and live there to learn about Buddhism, which means they brought stories from their culture, stories from South Asia went back there, and it became this mythological hub where passing mythologies and people and cultures would go in, and then they would also come spread back out. And Tales of Tremaine is the idea of tackling that through one person's life, though, one lens, because I wanted to use him sort of as a proto-hero where his own legends and deeds and lies in the present day have spread so far. Every culture has their sort of take and nod of his story, and no one knows the real details, and no one no longer attributes it to just him. Everyone has a version of him, and he's telling the audience the truth of how all that happened.
And they don't know the connection necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So, okay. Oh, there you go. There you go, folks. If you haven't started this one yet, that's what it's all about. Oh, and you've also been involved in a number of anthologies, as I think as an editor in a couple of situations, but then certainly as a contributor, and those have run the gamut of I think was Parallel Worlds one of the first ones besides the charity anthologies that you did.
Yes.
Yeah, and then there was Heroic Hearts, and some of the others. And can you tell us a little bit about the experience that you had? I know it's probably different for every one of them, but the anthology experience has got to be a different from writing a novel and being pretty much immersed in this world by yourself.
Right.
In anthology, you're having to kind of share with others, I guess, anyway.
So for me, the biggest, I don't want to say problem, but just different consideration was a lot of anthologies are themed. And what's really common is if you have something that fits from an existing story world you already have, it's business sense smart to include that because people will check that work out. But for a lot of the themes, unfortunately, I didn't, because what people were asking of me in the genres weren't things I was touching at the time. Whereas with Heroic Hearts, and this was also a dream come true because of the conversation I mentioned earlier with Jim Butcher, where he'd mentioned certain things happening in my life that I was fortunate enough to be invited to his urban fantasy anthology. And include my urban fantasy, The Grave Report, in there, which was obviously checking off that box of what he said, that one day I could be in an anthology with him. Most of the actual work in terms of contribution was actually pretty still easy, and I enjoyed it. The thing that stuck out to me was when I had to be an editor, and that was
Mhm.
very difficult. Not for the craft reasons of editing, but for the oh boy, just the
Decisions.
wranglings, decisions,
Yeah.
and wrangling authors. And obviously I'm guilty of that too. No author is really 100% punctual, and anthologies are very very different. Like most of the authors I know, and I've worked with art primarily short story authors first. They're career novelists. And there's sometimes a stigma of wanting to write a short story because you could use that time to write a book that's going to sell or write the next book in a series. And it was just so complicated getting everyone together and doing different editor parts because copy editing isn't my strength. And there's so many different edits. So I focused on developmental editing, and I was formatting and wrangling people together and calling in favors, which was very taxing in a different way. And then my partner on Parallel Worlds made sure we got the copy editing done and everything through there. Um, and it's not something I enjoyed. I don't like wrangling it. I don't like managerial duties. I would much rather be a contributor than ever have to edit and manage another anthology again. I'm perfectly okay being honest and upfront about that. That was a lot of different work I that was taxing.
Right. No, and I'm sure it is because I know I've seen a lot of people who are putting out calls for it. And
Hmm.
I'm thinking, oh boy, it's kind of like it's exciting and yet, um, just it's. I'm sure it's very demanding in the way that just creating your own work, as you're saying, uh,
Right, right, right.
yes, it's a different sort of demand of your time and your
Hmm.
patience, right?
That one especially, yes.
Yeah.
Patience.
Well, you have some very interesting magic systems in your work, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about those as they exist in those different series.
Sure. So in the Grave Report, Vincent Graves as a soul um, is usually put into the body of someone else who's killed by the paranormal. Um, but they're not a zombie. They're usually restored back to just moments before their death and close to perfect health or whatever. And I gave him the ability as a soul borrowing into the body to recover faster than a normal human. So he can heal from serious injuries far quicker than most people, unless they're outright fatal. He's not immortal, but it's not Deadpool where if his arm's cut off, he can grow it back in like a matter of moments or day. It's more like if he falls out of a building, which I have done to him before, instead of being instantly killed or shrugging it off in minutes, he might recover in 8 hours. So he has to go to the hospital, but he could be back in somewhat fighting shape. The way if Harry Dresden gets really battered. When I was creating this, I always viewed um, the Dresden Files in a lens of something I heard from Jackie Chan once, which I thought was beautiful, where he talked about how amazing Bruce Lee was, and he didn't want to be the same as Bruce Lee out of respect. What he wanted to do was have that level of skill and craft applied in a different way. So he was like, if Bruce Lee's the guy everybody loses to, that he beats up, I'll be the guy everyone can beat up, and it'll be funny. And Dresden was like that to me, where Dresden is, as much as he does get beat up, he's a magical juggernaut. And Vincent Graves became the magical punching bag instead. And I gave him just enough of the right kind of magic and skills to survive what I throw at him. And I quite throw a lot. So it's the idea of Jackie Chan to Bruce Lee. And there's
Okay.
only so long within the story lore because he's a foreign soul in someone else's body that he's allowed to stay in that body. So every book he starts off with a magical tattoo that's sort of emblazoned into his forearm of how long he has to solve the case, which is also tied to how long he can remain in that body. So there's a quite literal deadline timer ticking down every hour in the books. For I guess I'll use the first binding and Tales of Tremaine. I haven't openly explained the magic system yet on purpose because it's something between hard and soft magic. There are certain rules that the protagonist in the past story is figuring out and the audience is figuring out with him. He's learning it at a magical school. And as he does and understands the applications, the ways he can apply them in the broader spectrum are also slowly going to be revealed. But the idea is the principle that regardless of how they work, they're based in faith, a person's ability to believe they can do that in the first place, which is really hard. And I wanted that because I thought that was beautiful and it made magic feel magical again. Because faith can be cultivated, you can build faith, but it can also be broken. One traumatic moment can change a person's faith forever, which might mean you might lose the ability to perform magic or how you do it is affected. If you have an emotional wound And I really like the idea of a person's emotional state and their mental fortitude either being in sync or clashing, and that affects your magic. It makes it both extremely powerful but also unreliable. Because something I've always liked, and Jim and others have also talked about too, is using magic as a tool to hold your protagonist at risk. I don't want magic to solve the problems. I want people to solve the problems, and magic is a tool of how they can do that. But it shouldn't be the be all end all. Otherwise, there's not much besides just an author not wanting to that lets you just plot wave and solve everything with magic. The
Right.
rest is just going to be, I don't want to do it that way, but the audience will go, but he can. So why didn't you just do that then? Versus if there's a catch or a failing in the magic system or an inherent risk or danger, it stands to reason that you can't just magic away your problems. Because it's no different than if you had a gun or something. Well, that's a dangerous tool at the same time. If there's a risk something could go wrong, you'd be less likely to rely and use it all the time.
Right. Okay. That I like that point. That it's kind of like a different way of looking at the Deus ex machina,
Mhm.
Something coming in at the last moment and taking care of everything. Because if it doesn't have, if there's no risk associated with it, then it kind of takes the air out of any suspense that you might have going on, and
Right.
that can be an issue.
Absolutely.
Now, within your works, who have been some of your favorite secondary or recurring characters to write?
Oh, so in the Grave Report, obviously Camilla Ortiz, who is she fulfills the popular trope we see in a lot of buddy cop and police investigator stories, as well as classic detective and then urban fantasy, where she's an FBI investigator. I always loved her as an emotional balance and counter to Vincent because their personality types are very different, but they're united by the same goal of wanting to solve these crimes that fall outside the normal purview of human understanding because they're supernatural in nature. And she's a really good emotional check on him because he's had to work so long alone. He's kind of not balanced anymore because of other stuff that happens due to the magic system with his memories, his emotional instability. He doesn't have a set life. He doesn't no longer has a body, a normal identity, which will cause mental issues. And they sometimes clash or they sometimes get along. But I always thought that was a really good character to have and constantly keep her around as the story evolves. And I've liked their interactions. For Tales of Tremaine, the second book isn't out yet, but as you mentioned, you have an arc already. It's coming out this August, and the publisher's giving early access is out. One of my favorite characters is Ari's best friend that he meets when he's in the past in the Magical Academy, named Virdi, who is a musician. And he's some ways like many teenage boys, where he can be kind of full of himself and cocky and a little too amorous for his own nature, and maybe he needs to be a little bit more humble, but he has a heart of gold, and he's also like every other teenager trying to figure themselves out. He's a very good balance because while he has issues in his own life, he's really good as a mental check and a valve against Ari, which is what friends are supposed to do. Even though he has his faults, he can at least see his best friend's faults and try to ameliorate them, or at least support him in keeping things from going to be really bad, which is what friends sometimes do. If you're going to make a bad decision and there's nothing to stop you, they'll at least try to help you make it so that it doesn't become a worse decision.
Right. It's more, let's dilute this a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
so that you and others are still around by the end.
exactly.
Do you have any favorite antagonists from any of your works that have been, either, without giving away any plot points, is there anything you can say about, or even if you just tell people, look for this person
Right now in the first binding, that would be Coley, who I'm not going to spoil all the interactions about, but
Right.
that is a character I particularly love, and the audience will continue to learn more and more over the series in the course of the books, because at times they can be a distant antagonist. They are always throwing wrenches into the works, but you might not be aware of how yet. And obviously, one of my favorites is a school rival that Ari has, Nitham, because it's no different than like all the history of all the you go to like Draco Malfoy, anyone you want to pick, because it's high school. Everybody's had that one kid who just they cross a line and they keep doing it because that's kids, right? They're young,
Right.
emotionally developing, hormones are at their all-time high. You don't have the social graces. People are going to butt heads, and I think it's something that fits really well because you use the word antagonist, not villain. The character
Right.
isn't necessarily a villain, but he is someone who gets in Ari's way on the grounded part of his story, the every day to day living a school life. He gets in his way. He can make his life annoying. He can make his life a hell. And these are just two young boys who have egos, and unfortunately, for a while, that's a lot of young boys. Um, and I like that their antagonism can sometimes be a very realistic antagonism. There's no dialing up of evil fantasy bad guy. He's just a teenager, and he's unfortunately a cruel one.
Right. Perhaps misguided, but not
Yeah,
necessarily the same as being a bad guy.
exactly.
Somebody who, yeah, does bad things, but
Right.
now for you, how do you see the major differences, uh, you know, personality wise, um, between Vincent and Ari, and how would you say they are most alike?
So difference would be as much as Vincent can be erratic, his reasonings for his erraticism aren't the same as Ari's, where Vincent has degraded, unfortunately, when the series starts. He's been doing it starts in media res, so he already indicates to the audience he's been doing this for so long, bouncing in and out of bodies. He's lost his original identity and name. He's kind of not at fault as what's happened. He's going through essentially like a spiritual mental psychosis, and the series is him getting back to a stable point, which is what Ortiz actually helps because she becomes a recurring anchor through the series and a friend. Now he has some constancy in his life, and his attitude is actually improving through the books. Um, and he's also an adult throughout the story. So regardless of what's happening, he's in a father or protective role of other younger characters who show up, and that gives him another kind of grounding to work through and work with in relation to other characters, and it gives him some semblance of maturity, even though he can be uppity and snarky, just like Dresden or Philip Marlowe or all the traditional investigators who inspired the urban fantasy genre. That's usually towards an antagonist or a villain or something in a position of power, because that's what the noir genre always critiqued. You had Philip Marlowe snarking off to rich people who were really abusive and gaming the system. Robert Parker Spencer did the exact same thing as a detective, and Dresden obviously does that to supernatural beings much larger than him who would bully or hurt people. Whereas Ari, in the past, is unfortunately a traumatized child, and this isn't the modern world. They don't have therapy. He literally has been unfortunately in survival mode from one moment to the next, where if a tragedy happens, he's impoverished, he's just trying to get by, and there are moments where he's also responsible for other children as a child, which means he has to both be something of a mature adult before he's ready to an early parent, while still being an emotionally wounded child, and he hasn't had time to remedy that, which doesn't make him a bad person, but it means he's not going to be very stable. Unfortunately, he's going to react more in fight or flight mode. He's going to have an emotional wound that's easily triggerable. He's going to act like a hurt teenager would. And in the present, he's something closer of a tragic hero, and the audience doesn't know all of why yet. He's a bit more balanced and mature, but you could tell that something in his past deepened that wound, and he's trying to do better and do other things about it. There's a very clear difference between the past and present version of young Ari's trying to do everything he can to make his story popular and famous, and the old one has completely given that up and is trying to hide in anonymity. And I would say that both adult Vincent and adult Ari are very similar in that, where they're trying to do a job and pick up pieces and fix things. But Vincent and young Ari are very different, where Vincent at least knows he has to try to fix himself constantly, and he's working at it to the present day while trying to help other people. Young Ari is very obsessive, the way a teenager would, about getting what he wants and figuring out certain things involving his villains, but healing and fixing himself aren't necessarily on that list.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, if either or both, you can use both. If they were able to make a visit to any different, to make a guest appearance, I should say, in another series of a similar genre, which one of those would you pick? I have
Ooh.
a good idea what one of those would be,
Yeah.
uh, but then yeah, is there, if
If
they
I
could
could do
just pop in
anything,
and have as big or as small a role as you like, but one that they would fit in, or else or turn everything upside down. Uh,
hmm. For the childhood aspect of me, I think the funniest though, which would be interesting at work, would actually be if I could get Vincent into the X Files world, only because of the opposition of so much more scientific weirdness there versus
oh,
Vincent as a spirit, and seeing the crossover between the idea of aliens versus a supernatural being like him, and how that would go over, because I actually make something of a joke like that in the third book, where there is a girl who believes he's an alien, not a spirit, because she does not believe in the supernatural, and she thinks he's some kind of
oh,
possessive alien host instead, and he's constantly
yes.
trying to reassure, like, no, like, it sucks, but yes, magic is real, and I'm a spirit. I am not none of these things. And she's like, yeah, that's exactly what an alien would say. So to throw him into that actual world where aliens are a thing, and the idea and pursuit of them, where he could almost be both either a joke or a very odd anomaly, I think would just be really funny.
Yeah, that would be. That would. I could just see he and Mulder
Yeah.
interacting. That would be interesting. You got one for Ari? Do you think there's anything he could go show up in?
I don't know, because a lot of the book takes place with young Ari, and I don't think it'd be good to throw him into any fantasy series, because he's alive, because the fantasy series I have him in is more of a low fantasy, so there's less things there to kill him. And I'm like,
Right, well, that's true, yeah.
I can't throw him into Game of Thrones, because an emotionally unstable teenager in that world would die.
Yeah,
Um,
and
like,
many
just
of them
would,
did. Yeah,
and many of them do, exactly. And
yeah.
I'm trying to think, like, oh, he wouldn't last long in a lot of like high fantasy and epics. Honestly, oh boy, maybe I should not think about fantasy and think what it could be like in a different world altogether. Um, you know, this is really weird, but I think he could flourish, and it would be really interesting to see him in something like Treasure Island. The
Oh,
idea, uh,
yeah,
a very heroic or open-ended kind of quest story, because Tales of Tremaine in many ways is that, and it's inspired by the great epics, from whether you look at the Odyssey or Mahabharata, or the Norse stories, or the Finnish like the Kalevala, where they're just these greater than life stories about larger than life characters. So Treasure Island in some ways still suits that, with Jim Hawkins and this great adventure for treasure. Um, I could see him being a roguish archetype, absolutely having fun, and going through trials and tribulations in there that would complement him and the kind of story I'm trying to tell with him. I think he would fit in very well in that world, and it would actually kind of be very fun.
or you could raise the stakes and put him in Black Sails, but that's another
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's not a book series. So,
Oh yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
but it's sort of the same.
I
The
do love
same.
that franchise. So yeah.
Oh yeah, that was great. Now I know it probably well, maybe it's a hard question. Maybe it's a not. Maybe it's not. But do you have, out of all of the books you've written, do you have one that is your favorite? That either the process of writing it, or the finished product was something that you're most pleased with. Do you have one that stands out to you as a favorite?
Oh,
And if you don't, that's okay. But if you do, I'm sure everybody would love to hear.
I think right now it would actually, if I had to pick, it would be book 2 of Tales of Tremaine, which is coming out this August. And I think that's just a natural progression, because the last one I've recently written, in SFF at least, and it's just continuing all the skills and everything I built on, which is something that Jim teaches of make your next book the best book, and everything
Right.
I've learned from mystery, writing urban fantasy, um, detective stories, mythology, just culminated in that book, because I have plot twists and certain clue reveals in every Tales of Tremaine book that I've actually taken from learning to write urban fantasy as a mystery detective series. So a lot of those techniques also show up with certain clues that if you look backwards, some people might figure out and add up to this is where the plot twist comes from, or certain foreshadowing techniques, and being able to incorporate all that into this picaresque and buildings Roman fantasy. has been really rewarding. Every one of these books I write, I'm probably going to change my answer to once I write the third book. But I
Right,
do
right.
believe it's that one because I recently wrote my first thriller novel, and I don't feel the same way because writing a thriller in some ways was simpler in a really nice way. It was cathartic, and I had to do and learn different skills to just write a thriller that's not enmeshed in SFF. But it felt like I'm still using the same skills as urban fantasy because they're still built off of thrillers and detective novels. Whereas
Right.
Tales of Tremaine was very challenging in a different way, and it was really cathartic when I was done with it to read book two and see everything I'd accomplished with it.
Great. Okay. Yeah, it's more of probably more of a journey that you're
Yeah.
figuratively and for real, right?
Mhm.
Now, was there one of your books kind of the counterpoint to that question is there one that was particularly difficult in terms of getting through for whatever reason while you were
Um,
writing?
while I was writing it, hmm.
So, like, was there one that had?
Yeah, it would be the thriller, but not actually because of anything in the thriller. It's because of how much I was juggling during life while writing it. And SFF has also been an emotional, I guess, escape, which it is for a lot of authors. So there's an emotional
Mm,
dopamine hit when you're writing it, and that helps. Like it skyrockets your mood. You feel great writing it if that's what you do. And the thriller was a different kind of distance. I came in a lot more on the only craft oriented side. It felt a lot more of a logical of a task where I just treated it like a job, which isn't a bad thing because it is a job. But every day it wasn't like, oh, I want to write this really cool, scene. I guess like a fantasy, like with the dragon or something. There was none of that. It was a lot more approaching it like, okay, I've done this. This is the next chapter. These are the scenes I need to hit because they elicit this emotional beat or they pay off this thing I set up a few chapters ago. And it was a lot more of like I'm going through a proper checklist of things to achieve and write, which meant while I'm going through certain life things, there's not that dopamine hit or that emotional, oh, that was a really cool magical scene or whatever. I still enjoyed it. It just, I approached it in a very different way. And it didn't, I guess, just give me the same emotional hits that I was getting through writing fantasy.
okay. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. I'd be curious to hear if, that it's that way for some other folks who
Mhm.
have written, more than just one type. Now, I know that you read all the time, that which is great because you talk about the things that you read yourself. But what and that you're very interested in mythology and not just. I mean, you do it for your background, for your work, but also just because you love it.
Right.
So, what does your pleasure reading consist of?
Oh, if we're not talking just SFF books, because that's the obvious answer too.
Anything.
Um,
I mean, anything
okay.
that you like.
I really do love certain nonfiction or historical fiction as well. Right now, I'm actually reading was the Wagger or the Wagoner, which is about a mutiny on a British trading vessel.
Oh yeah.
And it's by the author who also wrote Killers of the Flower Moon. I love actually collecting old classic fairy tales before they've been altered. So I've been trying to collect fairy tales from as many cultures as I can. I have old Persian or Iranian fairy tales. I just got a collection of South Asian ones that have been translated. Um, I have something called Jatka tales, which are some of the oldest, I guess what you'd call fairy tales or wonder tales that are heavily rooted in Buddhism. And there's actually research indicating there are some of the stories that helped influence nearly 30 to 50% of all fairy tales in the world.
Wow.
Um, and you go back to finding certain classics that you could see where the evolution of like the talking animal fables come from. And I just love seeing that kind of stuff and hunting them down. I had this whole collection of really weird, just odd fairy tales that are tied into some mythology too. That's a pleasure. And besides that, I guess comics. I'm a
Yeah.
huge comic buff. I have at this point I can't collect physical comics anymore because I'm limited for space. So I have nearly terabytes of just comics from everything from DC comics to obviously standard Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, small independent runs. Something I'm reading a few right now, which are rereading Hellblazer, which is the original John Constantine, who was probably one of the early urban fantasy or urban
Right.
occult magical characters. Morning Glories, which is a magical sort of school academy comic. I think I forgot the name of the series. I think it's called Black Magic or Black Magic Department, which is either set in Seattle or Portland. I don't recall because I just got it, and it's a paranormal investigator series set there.
Oh,
And I'm rereading a I can't remember if it's Russian or Polish sort of supernatural haunted comic called Domovoy, which is about a spirit.
nice. Wow. Okay. Well, those sound interesting. So, some some of our viewers may be jotting these names down. Let's hope so. Some of those I've never heard of before. So that's awesome. Now, and this is kind of a craft question,
Okay.
but do you do you prefer when you're writing? Do you like some kind of background sound going on, or do you prefer absolute quiet?
Um, I can write in both, but now I prefer background sound because I used to use it to drown out other sounds that were distracting. There was a time where I was a mechanic when I still had a day job, and I would have a really tiny tablet, and I would have to tune out all the sounds of impact wrenches and stuff because there were moments where I could write.
Yeah.
You don't have a car to do. You might have 30 minutes before one comes in if it's slow, or a break, and we were paid by the cars we did on a flat rate. So if you don't have a car you're working on, you're not getting paid. So I could sit there with the tablet real quick and very tiny micro 8-inch tablet and just write enough scenes that I could take home and then transfer to my larger computer. And I would have headphones on and I would listen to I don't know what the genre is called, but I always see it on YouTube and stuff called like epic music, where it's like compilations of soundtracks from video games, movies,
Oh,
animes that they don't have lyrics though, because that does distract me. I don't know if it's the ADHD or something, but I can't have words, so I listen to it as a background track, and then it's just gotten to the point where now I'm so accustomed to it to tune out other noises that it's my go-to, that and it does help me focus now. I can't not write or edit without something like that at this point. So I've invested a lot because of it in headphones. I have
oh yeah, I
tons of
bet.
headphones. I've become an audiophile where I have like some headphones that are a couple $1,000s that's like really, really high end, really, really nice. Because it does make a difference. Like not necessarily in the writing, but I've noticed the hearing pleasure of music is better through them. And then of course I will write with those then.
Yeah, I've heard, and I've heard a lot of people say that those who do like to have some background sound, that if it's, that typically it's music without lyrics, that
Mm-hmm.
that is something that they enjoy and that they
Mm-hmm.
find, you know, in some cases almost essential, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, now for my last question, if there's anything you're able to talk about, what can people be looking for next from you? What can we look forward coming from you?
Oh, well, under my normal name, Ronnie Virdi, which is one part of my name that makes up our Virdi, I will hopefully have a thriller, a traditional, more like a Hollywood thriller coming out in a year or two, depends on when we sell it. Obviously, Tales of Tremaine 3, which I'm going to begin writing in a month or two. I am currently finishing up a bundle of novellas and short stories set in the Tales of Tremaine universe that I'm hoping to release for free as an ebook, just as a thank you to all the love and support I've gotten for the fans. I am currently working on Graves 4. I'm about 40,000 words in. I'm hoping to have that done sometime for the new future. And I just started something else, and I forgot the title because I had a few in my document. I have like 3 or 4. It's like which one sounds better. I'm just trying to remember, but I have a historically inspired fantasy series. It's not a historical fiction, but it's drawing a lot from history in the secondary world, and I'm about 8 chapters into that on the side. And that might sell hopefully off of the sample, and maybe I can get that out too.
Oh, great! And as I recall, there was some kind of novella.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
thank you. I have a finished supernatural investigator novella, more like in the vein of Hellboy and the original Constantine stories. It's just going through editing, but the actual draft is done, and there's a cover for it called "Where the Ghosts Play." That's based off of real life local legends, and that one is a nod to the Dead Children's Playground in Huntsville, Alabama, which is a real cemetery that has a playground on it. And then there's a lot of local legends and spooky myths around it, and those come up for discussion and being investigated in that particular novella.
Yes, and I'm sure that people are going to be looking forward to all of these things. You're certainly a busy guy, that's for sure. Uh, but Ronnie, thank you so much for
Thanks for having me.
yeah, certainly for talking about all this, and it's nice to I mean, we've done several panels together over
Right.
the
Yeah.
years and all of that.
And
But it's
this year again too.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. But it's also nice to get to talk to just you for a while and delve into some of these things. So I really appreciate it very much. I want to thank all of our viewers that will see this, and also just to let you know something else we have coming up later this month is on Monday the 26th at 8 p.m. live will be our season 3 Lost Girl Revisited. We'll be talking about all of the episodes in season 3 of that show. So anybody who's interested in that can join us. And next month in March, the author interview will be with Linda Robertson Reinhardt. We don't have a date picked out for that yet, but that's something else to look forward to. And I hope everybody will join us. But Ronnie, once again, thank you so much for doing this, for taking time away from your writing to talk about, guess what, your writing. And I'm sure all of your fans who will watch this will, enjoy hearing more about the process. And hopefully some of you who have seen this who've said, hey, I've heard of that guy, will now be going out and finding his book. So thank you again. And I will see you at Dragon Con.
See you then. Thank you for having me.
Okay.